Okay, hi, my name is Bruce Moravchik, and I am one of the coordinators of the NOAA Planet Stewards Education Project. This evening, we're glad to have Dr. Don Haas and Dr. Ingrid Zabel to present to us the teacher-friendly guide to climate change, a free resource to help you teach climate and stay sane. Please pay attention to this information on this initial slide in case you get disconnected. Very important. I have a few announcements and then we'll get started. So first of all, tonight's broadcast is being recorded, and I am going to send you a link to a video archive within a week, hopefully much, much sooner. If you don't get a link to the archive in a week, send me an email. All you need to do is put request link, November 13th, 2018 webinar in the subject. I'll make sure to get it out to you. And please note that the video archive and all the slides that are presented tonight, both these slides as well as the presentation slides and of previous broadcasts going all the way back to 2013, are available on our Planet Stewards Google website, the link which you see here, and you'll be able to see again during the archive. If you can't access the site, you can send an automatic access request through Google, or you can email me. Subject, just say request access to the PSEP Google site, and I'll do my best to get you connected. The only caveat is that you are going to need to have a Google account, which is different from a Gmail account, but I'll explain that in some emails that I'll send as follow-up to this. Please note that all your microphones are muted during the broadcast. If you'd like to ask a question to our presenters or to me, please type it into your GoToWebinar control panel. When the presenters stop to take questions at any point, I'll be sure to ask it to them. If we don't have time, we'll save those to the end. And I'd like everyone to know that during tonight's broadcast, I will be sending out everyone who registered an email with a link to a post-webinar poll. Please respond to us as soon as the webinar is over. I know how easy it is to forget. It takes just about a minute. It does provide a lot of important information, and it does help us prepare for future events. For everyone who's signed in this evening and who's on for the full period, we are going to be sending out this certificate of attendance denoting your one contact hour of professional development through our NOAA Planet Stewards program, signed by both myself and Molly Harrison, my coordinator in our program. And for those of you who don't know yet, stewardship community applications are now being accepted for the Planet Stewards 2019 Stewardship Community. If you join this community and are accepted, you'll learn how to write a federal funding proposal with a group of your peers. You could receive up to $2,500 to carry out an environmental stewardship project, and you can meet educators across the country who share your interest in STEM and environmental stewardship. If this sounds like something you might be interested in, you should definitely join up. We accept formal and informal educators that work with kindergarten through college-age students, and we're accepting applications until midnight December 2nd. If you go to the NOAA Planet Stewards website, there's much more information as well as a link to the application. And if you want to learn more, please join us for a special webinar 1 week from today on November 20th at 8 p.m. Eastern Time. Molly Harrison will be giving a webinar, The What, Wheres, Hows, and Whys of Joining the 2019 Stewardship Community. If you'd like more information and a link to register, just all you need to do is go to the NOAA Planet Stewards upcoming events webpage. Or if you go to our regular webpage, you can sign up for our email list, and we'll be sending out another reminder later this week for that. I also want to let everyone know that if that's not a lot of information, we've got a great book club meeting coming up. And this is by Lisa Gardner, and it's Tales from an Uncertain World, What Other Assorted Disasters Can Teach Us About Climate Change. And we have the extra benefit that Lisa will be leading the book club discussion. It's always nice when the author leads the discussion. Now, I'd like everyone to know that this is a dial-in number and spaces are really limited. This is going to be first come, first serve. We have about, I think, 50 or 60 spots available, which is far less than the people who have signed up and are attending this evening's webinar. So I'd just like you to know that spaces are limited. Try and get on early. On our upcoming events section of our the NOAA Planet Stewards webinar, we have our entire book club session. We have all of our book club sessions for the year listed out, and I want to tell you they are terrific books on a range of subjects. I really recommend that you check them out. And with that, I'm going to turn the screen over to Don as I begin some introductions, and then we can start formally. So thank you, Don, and thank you, Ingrid, for being here this evening. Dr. Don Haas is Director of Teacher Programs at the Paleontological Research Institution and its Museum of the Earth and Cayuga Nature Center in Ithaca, New York. He currently serves as the president of the National Association of Geoscience Teachers. Don's work in public outreach, teacher education, teacher professional development, and curriculum materials development marries a deep understanding of how people learn with deep understandings of the Earth system. He's a nationally regarded expert in climate and energy education, place-based and technology-rich Earth and environmental science education, and is the co-author of the books The Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change and The Science Beneath the Surface, a very short guide to the Marcellus Shale. He served on the Earth and Space Science Design Team for the National Research Council's framework for the K-12 science education, practices cross-cutting concepts and core ideas, and he has taught at Colgate, Cornell, and Michigan State Universities, as well as Kalamazoo College and Tapestry and Norwich in New York high schools. Now, Dr. Ingrid Zabel is the Climate Change Education Manager at PRI and is interested in building public understanding of the science and societal impacts of climate change. Ingrid leads climate change science activities with youth and the public at the Cayuga Nature Center and Museum of the Earth and schools in Ithaca, New York, and New York City. She also develops science exhibit content, manages citizen science projects, and is one of the authors of PRI's Teacher-Friendly Guide to Climate Change. She's the curator of 2 state-level portals to climate change resources, the New York Climate Change Science Clearinghouse and Resilient MA for the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. And I'd like everyone to know that Dr. Haas and Dr. Zabel's bios and links to many of the things that I mentioned just now are also found on our Google site. So you can check those out after the webinar. And now, Dr. Haas, Dr. Zabel, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'll start off by noting that up until a week ago, I was president of the National Association of Geoscience Teachers, and now I am past president. So you've heard about us. That's what we look like. And I want to start with a question which Bruce can show up in a way that you can interact with. So just wondering if folks knew about the book before signing up.
Very good. So everyone should be able to see the poll that's on your screens right now. Please feel free to click on the poll, and we'll give that just about a minute or so for everyone to vote. And then we'll close up the poll, and we'll see what people think. We'll give it just another few moments. Okay, it looks like we've got most of the people voting, so let's close that up and we'll share it. Can you see the results, Don and Ingrid?
Yes, I can.
Very good.
Okay, good to know. Alrighty, so we'll give you a quick overview. We're going to take a look, the next several slides step through the table of contents. And actually, before getting to the table of contents, there's the cover, and a note that it's available as a free download. I'll also note that I'll tell a little bit of a backstory in that this book the writing of the book was funded by a climate research grant at Cornell University with the principal investigator is Natalie Mahawald, who is also the lead author of the recent IPCC report that is terrifying. And because it was written with funding from the National Science Foundation, we're able to provide it free as a PDF. We are also in the process of sending it to, our goal is every high school in the US through a crowdfunding campaign. The book was about to go to press last May, a year and a half ago May, and just as it was about to go to press, it hit the news that the Heartland Institute was sending out a book of non-climate science to science teachers across the country. And we said, if they're going to send their book to every science teacher in the country, we should do the same. So we're doing a crowdfunding campaign in hopes of getting a hard copy into every high school in the country. And maybe if we're successful at that, we'll go to middle schools and beyond. But it is free as a download for anybody at that website. And stepping through the table of contents, and Ingrid, feel free to chime in at any point too. I'm just going to kind of scroll through this, say a tiny bit about it, and I think it's somewhat self-explanatory what the chapter titles are, and the contents of the chapter with the major headings labeled there. Most, if not every chapter has a resources section, as well as the sections that differ from chapter to chapter. Two unique aspects, let me back up. Two unique aspects about the book, we think, are that it not only pays good attention to the physical science of climate change, but also addresses some of the issues that make teaching about climate change a different kind of challenge than teaching about igneous rocks, for example. So there's attention to the social science. Additionally, we do a good solid overview of the physical science and climate change through Earth history, chapter 4 by Rob Ross and others, is not included in many books, and we think that's actually quite important to understand how climate has changed over the last 4.5 billion years, and how what we're facing today is a different kind of climate change than what came before. For one thing, there's civilization now. And then evidence for and causes of recent climate change, an overview of that, and looking regionally. And we address mitigation and geoengineering. We think it's important to pay attention to these issues, whether or not they actually happen, and we're not advocating for or against approaches here, but we think it's important to look at the science related to geoengineering, for example. And then on to adaptation, and then the last couple of chapters that are numbered deal with some of those social science issues. And we're actually going to draw from chapter 11 for part of the session tonight. The frequently asked questions was a late edition that came up as a response to the Heartland Institute book. As I said, we were about to go to press when that hit the news that was being shipped all over the country. And so the frequently asked questions chapter addresses some of that. There is also a glossary, which is of note, and an index as well. Ingrid, do you want to add anything to what I've said there?
No, I think that's a good overview.
Okay. Well, we'll go on to the second question. And so, Bruce, if you want to pop up the interactive question, that'd be great. There it is. So we'll give you a minute to take the poll.
Okay, we've got quite a few people who have chimed in, so if you have not yet, please register your opinion. Okay, looks like we have most people, so I will close it up now.
Interesting. Okay. Awesome. Interesting. What's the word I want? Not bipolar distribution, but two peaks. I'm kind of bipolar on the issue myself. All right, that's maybe not what I would have guessed, but I'm glad to see lots of people are hopeful. Okay, and now I'm going to turn it over to Ingrid, though I'm going to continue to click the buttons.
All right, thank you. So I'm going to focus in on the adaptation and mitigation chapters. These are chapters about actions to respond to climate change. And I want to talk about action-oriented approaches as a way to help maintain hope and stay sane. And in this section, the examples may be ones that I've put together, but the ideas are heavily influenced by the work of other people, especially Laura Faye Tenenbaum and Susan Joy Hassel. And I've used some of their approaches to help myself stay sane because it can be depressing to think about climate change. So these bullets just show the three approaches I'm going to talk about. So next slide, please. All right, so I think one thing that can be really helpful if you're starting to feel down about climate change and what's happening is to look at what other people are doing. And there's really a lot out there. People are doing a lot in this country and around the world. The examples in my slide tend to be very focused on New York State because that's where I work, so just to let you know that ahead of time. But here in New York State, there's a lot of interest at the state government level at modernizing the electric grid. Community solar is big here. I constantly get advertisements in the mail about new community solar projects that my household could sign up for. Next slide, please. Advocacy. So I gave an example here from New York City and an advocacy effort that started right after Hurricane Sandy. So in New York City, there are these areas called significant maritime industrial areas, and they are from the time when waterfronts were not thought of as places to build luxury condos, but they were places where industry was built. So this is quite a long time ago, and there's still industrial areas in New York City. And when you have a storm like Superstorm Sandy, there can be tremendous flooding and hazards from release of toxins, so really significant water pollution. And it turns out that in these industrial areas, of course, there are also people living. And these are people who are often underrepresented in getting attention from city government. So the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance advocated very strongly with the mayor's office to rethink, redefine these industrial areas and take into account that this was a place where people lived and they needed to take into account how to protect these people the next time there's a storm like this. So this is just one example, but I think there's a lot of social advocacy out there. Another one is teens suing the US government to take action on climate change. So you may have heard of this, and this is a lawsuit that many people thought would get thrown out along many steps of the way, but it hasn't yet. So this is incredibly encouraging to think of these young people trying to take charge of their future this way. Next slide, please. And this is another example from the coastal New York City area of projects to try to reduce coastal storm risks. A lot of them are trying to use nature-based solutions, whether it's different ways of planting along a shoreline, or in this case, living breakwaters. This is the idea of reintroducing oyster reefs. So oyster reefs, which were once plentiful around Long Island and the New York City area, not only provided food, but the reefs themselves would break up the wave action from storms. And those reefs have been over-harvested and damaged, but one can build up artificial reefs again, and oysters will come back. And it's a way to protect the shoreline. So again, just one example. There are many, many more across the country of things people are doing to adapt to climate change and to change our energy systems. And I think it's very encouraging to look at these. All right, next slide, please. And I think it's maybe a set of questions. Yes. So if you could bring up these questions, Bruce, about students.
Okay, most people have voted. Can you see?
Okay.
Okay, very good.
Yep, I see the results. Thank you. And so it looks like a majority are saying no, but quite a few are saying yes. And then there's a follow-up question. If your answer was yes, what do you think motivates your students? And I have a few choices there. And if your answer is no, what do you think deters them? And I realize these 5 answers are not exhaustive. If you have sort of other thoughts, you could maybe type them in the chat or bring them up later in the webinar.
Okay, we've just got about 80% of people voting.
Mm-hmm.
So, and a few comments. But looks like we have most people. So, let's see.
Okay. So for the people who said yes and feel their students are motivated, it looks like it's sort of equally split among the things that motivate them. Same with the people who said no. So yeah. Interesting. Mm-hmm. Okay.
I don't see any comments in the chat. Or
Pardon me?
I thought you said there were some comments in the chat, but I don't see any.
Oh, I'm sorry. They're in the questions
Okay.
tab. Yes. So we can get to those later on.
Okay. So yeah, I wanted to talk a little bit about students and working with students and thinking about what can students do, because my experience with students is mixed. I've found some students who are very excited and hopeful, and others who are feel they can't contribute. I have once worked with a student who said, well, I'd love to have an electric car, but my family could never afford that. And he seemed sort of despondent about that. So how do we talk to students about what they can do? So I try to frame it as what students can do now and what they can do in the future. So here are a few examples. So students can do an energy audit at their school. The photo is some students who did a project at the Cayuga Nature Center. And in this particular photo, they're counting up light bulbs and looking at, they did some calculations to look at the energy savings and costs and so on of switching to LED lights. So do an energy audit and then encourage your school to take action to reduce energy use. Food recovery. So it turns out that food loss and food waste are a large contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. One estimate I saw said 8% of worldwide greenhouse gas emissions come from food loss and waste. We know that food waste in the United States is shockingly high. It's something like between 30 and 40% of food is wasted. And so certainly there's so much that can be done here, and not just because of climate change, but think if one could use that food to feed people who need food. So this is something that students can work on in their school. They can work on as individuals in their homes. I mentioned the Food Recovery Network here. This is an organization that works at college campuses. So certainly if you're working with high school students, you can talk about this with them and say, when you get to college, you can get involved in this. Helping your family prepare a go bag. So a go bag is a backpack that's planned and thought out with things that a family might need to take with them very quickly in an emergency situation. And the photo and the link I put up is from New York City Office of Emergency Management. And there, the context is thinking about coastal storms. Say there's another Hurricane Sandy. But I thought of this morning when I heard a piece on the radio about people in California who had to flee the wildfires very quickly, and a man talking about how his family had a plan. They had a plan. They even had some bags packed. So this can apply in many situations. Public transportation. So this is a way to reduce emissions, per capita emissions. So if more people walked and biked or used public transportation, we would emit a lot of less greenhouse gas emissions. And kids do this all the time. Kids already walk and bike because they can't drive yet, or kids take school buses. So kids are already experts at this, and adults could learn from kids. And kids can advocate for more support infrastructure in their towns. More bike lanes, more safe ways to school so they can walk to school. Another thing students can do now is learn about climate change and learn about solutions and educate others. I think kids don't realize how powerful they are. But I think often if a young person tries to reach the mayor's office, they might get through, whereas an adult might not, or to go to a public meeting. And I just show one place, if you're looking for inspiration, a great place to see what kids can do is the Young Voices for the Planet website, and there's some wonderfully inspiring videos there. All right, next slide, please. Next slide, please. So this is about what students can do in the future. So there's certain things that kids can't do yet. Most kids in high school can't vote yet, but once they're 18, they can vote. And they can think about careers in fields where they can help to reverse climate change, or help people adapt to it, or help educate about it. And that's at the bottom. I just mentioned, keep learning and educating. They need to keep doing that in the future, as I think we all do. All right, next slide, please. So I want to finish with talking about turning impacts into opportunities. So these are some photos of impacts of climate change in New York State, but in many other places across the country. Climate change is impacting many sectors, and you see photos of flooding and damage to infrastructure and public health crises, for instance, extreme heat events. And I'm not going to go into detail about these, but I would encourage you to talk with students about these impacts result in opportunities for individuals in the sense that there's a lot of work to be done here. So if you go to the next slide, with these same sectors, these are some examples. So for instance, in agriculture, dairy cows produce less milk under extreme heat. So somebody needs to design barns that keep livestock cooler. And somebody needs to research new crop varieties that are more tolerant to heat in the future. In buildings, somebody needs to design more energy efficient buildings so we use less energy and emit less greenhouse gases. Somebody needs to design gardens and landscaping that'll keep buildings cool. In coastal areas, we need more people to work on nature-based solutions to protect coasts, like the artificial oyster reefs I mentioned. We need people to develop better flood insurance tools. So if people are interested in insurance and finance industry, there's work to be done there. With ecosystems, there's concern about fish passage through culverts. So if we're getting more extreme storms and debris gets knocked down and it blocks culverts, then organisms can't pass through those culverts, in addition to a lot of damage to roadways from that. And for fish, their only way they have really to adapt to climate change is to swim to cooler water. So people can design better culverts and build them. We need people to monitor invasive species, which are going into new areas as the climate changes. Energy, we definitely need people to innovate or finance cleaner energy technologies, to design better technologies, to build a modernized electric grid. Public health, we need people to work on heat emergency plans and to build networks to keep people safe during heat emergencies. We need people in the medical profession to research treatments for climate-related illnesses, such as heat illnesses. Transportation, we need people to manage transportation systems during emergencies, people to advocate different forms of transportation, to research and develop better batteries for electric vehicles, and actually energy storage in general. And finally, water resources. So we need for people to fight for equity and access to clean water after storms, people to design what's called green infrastructure. So again, using nature to manage stormwater. And these are just a few examples, but there's a lot of work to be done, and there's a lot of work that students can do in the future. And to me, I think this can help build hope in the sense that students can do something about climate change. So I will turn it over to Don again.
Do we want to pause and take a couple of questions here?
Oh, sure. Mm-hmm.
Well, thanks. You know, one question that I got, it was actually more than one question, was Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown was mentioned, and I've shared the link with everyone. And the question really came up to, can you see some of the solutions that have been presented in Paul Hawkins' book Drawdown to sort of, I guess, combat climate change being successfully used with classrooms of 4th through 9th graders? I mean, a lot of these, I guess, things that you've mentioned here are sort of much larger ways to combat climate change. What are ways that educators can work directly with their students to make them feel as though they're having a substantive impact on this issue?
So I'll address that initially, but Don, feel free to chime in. So there have been teachers who worked with the Drawdown project with schools. I saw a presentation on the CLEAN network in the summer. I think it was in August. The CLEAN is the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network. The website is cleannet.org. And they have weekly teleconferences about climate education, energy education. There's a presentation by a teacher who had used those concepts in her classroom. I think it was high school level. But I think, yeah, if you look at even just the top 10 ranked solutions on drawdown. There are definitely ones that could be implemented in a school. And the easy one is food waste. So food waste is way up there. I think it was number 4 maybe on the list of solutions. And that's certainly something that kids can understand and develop a program in their school to reduce food waste. And I don't have the list in front of me, but I think there were 1 or 2 others in the top 10 or top 20 that would lend themselves to working in elementary or middle schools.
Yeah, and I think it's also worth noting we're working on having a drawdown workshop at the Museum of the Earth in the spring sometime, but we have not locked in on that yet. But hopefully that'll happen for folks who are in central New York and can come and attend that. And I think kind of in.
Okay, that has never happened to me before. Very well. We still have some folks that are left on the line.
Oh, I think they've all joined back in, which is nice. Thank you for coming back.
So, Don, you have the comm back. Your screen should be showing.
Okay, there we are.
So
I think I was just starting to say that I think an important way to look at some of this stuff is to kind of change the way we talk about things. We tend to focus a lot on how to improve the efficiency of. Oh, am I on?
No, you're on. You're on.
I hear you.
Okay, I was hearing something telling me I was unmuted when I thought I already was. So one of the ways that I like to talk about this to kind of shift the way of thinking about it is that we need to shift from a primary focus on making more efficient cars to making a transportation system that's more efficient than cars. And we can say that about a lot of different systems that when we see innovations that make a difference, they tend to involve changing technologies or changing infrastructures, which, by the way, relatedly, says something about why we struggle to change schools, is that we've stuck with the same infrastructure and technologies in a lot of ways for a very, very long time. So there's interesting parallels there to changes in systems, but I really think that kind of paradigm shift is very, very important and not talked about enough. And I'll also note that in thinking about different energy technologies, the only truly energy or environmentally friendly energy is the energy you don't use. It's when you're making lots and lots of energy, no matter how you do it, it's got substantial environmental consequences. Although coal, for example, has a lot more negative environmental consequences than solar, but solar is not free environmentally or economically. Do we want to take maybe one more question on this slide and then move on to the next piece? Or not?
Well done. The questions all got erased when we got kicked out. So we're just going to have to keep moving forward.
Alrighty, we can do that. So we're going to shift gears and go towards the end of the book and flip over to a Prezi, which is not there, here. Let me get that up to full screen. And so this is drawing from chapter 11. It's 2 sections of chapter 11, looking at fire and brimstone and Fort McMurray, and I'm just going to kind of dig into that. And of course, it comes from the teacher-friendly guide. And I'll ask you to sort of reflectively think about what fire and brimstone brings to mind, and really what the purpose of this section of the book is to help us think about how to be cautious in using doom and gloom in our discussions, because that can often have undesired effects. But I think if we're more thoughtful about where this kind of rhetoric comes from, then we'll use it more effectively, or sometimes opt not to use it at all. So what do you picture when we think about fire and brimstone, and how does it relate to the way you see the world, and maybe how it relates to the way some of your students might see the world that differs from the way you see the world is very much worth thinking about. Fire and brimstone comes from the book of Revelation, and a quote from the King James Version of the Bible. And the devil that deceived them was cast into the lake of fire and brimstone, where the beast and false prophet are, and shall be tormented day and night forever and ever. Nice cheery thought to keep us going, and that's 100-year-old, or I'm sorry, 400-year-old or so depiction of what fire and brimstone looks like. And here's a more modern look at it. I don't know if this one's going to work, but hold up.
What he means is Old Testament, Mr. Mayor. Real wrath of God type stuff. Fire and brimstone coming down from the skies. Rivers and seas boiling. 40 years of darkness, earthquakes, volcanoes, the dead rising from the grave. Human sacrifice, dogs and cats living together. Mass hysteria. Enough, I get the point.
So there you go. Where this section of the book came from was in the summer of 2016, spring and summer of 2016, there were massive fires in Fort McMurray in Alberta, Canada. And we'll just, take a quick look at some video of that. Mute that. And I saw this and I thought, oh my gosh, that looks like fire and brimstone, which now, of course, we're seeing in California. The fires of the spring and summer of 2016 in Fort McMurray led to the largest evacuation in Canadian history, the most expensive natural disaster in Canadian history. 90,000 people, the video here came out during the fires and said 80,000. It actually was 90,000 people were ultimately evacuated from Fort McMurray. And these fires burned for months, as the California fires are doing now. And I thought, wow, that looks like fire and brimstone. So that led me to some more thinking about fire and brimstone and apocalyptic rhetoric, which we've been using apocalyptic rhetoric as long as we've been telling stories. We've been telling stories about the end of the world. The Lorax is, I think, a pretty decent example of that, using fire and brimstone type of imagery to help us think about how to change our ways. And I'll also note that this is actually not a quote from the Lorax, it's a quote from the Onceler in the book, The Lorax. So we've been telling these apocalyptic stories as long as we've been telling stories. And it's often very easy in polarizing issues to find different kinds of apocalyptic stories at both poles of the issue in question. So for climate change, that at one pole, that's the destruction of the environment and civilization, or even the entire Earth. And at the other extreme, it's the economy or the American way of life. And, again, what I'm sort of digging into is are we using these ways of framing these things thoughtfully? And I think sometimes we are, and sometimes we're not. And it's helpful to, and I'll note I'm also the grandson of a preacher, and the son of a librarian who was very interested in religious literacy. So I'm not a religious specialist, but I know more about this than the average American, I think. So apocalyptic stories involve prophecies, and prophecies are predictions. And I think what we're seeing today is predictions made by climate scientists coming true pretty regularly. And we're seeing that, like I said, right now in California, in Fort McMurray, what they saw a couple of summers ago, and the fires of last year in California. were very much in line with what climate scientists were predicting. So in a certain way, climate scientists were behaving as prophets. Prophecies are more than predictions, however. They're also calls to change one's evil ways and to repent. And to repent is not simply to apologize, but also to change one's ways. And I think climate scientists are not only making predictions, but they're saying why these really pretty horrible, for the most part, changes are taking place, and giving us information about how we ought to repent and change our ways. And I think if you bring that kind of discussion in, that maybe makes the discussion a little bit more effective. Fort McMurray is, I don't know how many folks are aware of the biggest industry in Fort McMurray, but it's the oil sands extraction or tar sands extraction. Oil sands and tar sands are essentially synonyms. It is a really energy intensive and polluting way of getting oil. And this is what it looks like from a satellite view. You can see this is huge. This is a 20-mile scale bar, so the area covered or uncovered by the oil sands extraction in Alberta is just gigantic. And I'm going to step in and look at these huge yellow pyramids. And again, reveal the scale bar. So that's 2,000 feet across. A mile is 5,280 feet. So that's almost 4/10 of a mile. You can see these are gigantic, these huge yellow pyramids. They're stories tall. And to give you a different sort of more concrete scale, that's a tractor trailer right there. And these are, like I said, multiple stories tall. And what they are is brimstone, as it turns out. Brimstone is an archaic term for sulfur. And it gets that name because sulfur forms at the brim of volcanoes, in some volcanoes, that is. And it is also a byproduct of refining oil from tar sands. And they sell as much as they can, but they can't sell as much as they produce. If you've ever been to the port in Vancouver, they ship it by rail to Vancouver, and it's there in huge yellow mountains that kind of stink too. But they produce way more than they can sell. And I had let that slip my mind. And as I was thinking about fire and brimstone, I Googled brimstone, and brimstone, like I said, is sulfur. And I thought, wow, that's an impressive coincidence. And in thinking about what's going on elsewhere in the world, and this presentation is a year old now or so, so it doesn't have the current fire seasons, although it mentions them. The Fort McMurray fires are but one example of recent fires of biblical proportions. That's Baton Rouge's Great Flood of 2016, last year's hurricane season, this year's hurricane season, the hurricane that hit the Florida Panhandle and the Southeast earlier this year came ashore with winds 2 miles per hour below Category 5. Just stunning damage, and I think remarkably out of the news now that it shouldn't be. This is Buffalo's knife storm of a couple of years ago, a little more than a couple of years ago. I think it was 2015. And this is an open door with a wall of snow. I actually telecommute from Buffalo to Ithaca. This is about 10 miles from my house where this took place, and this picture is about 5 miles from my house. The lake effect cloud covering half of Buffalo. And at my house, 10 miles from my house, they got 7 feet of snow. At my house, we got 2 feet. Another 10 miles north of me, they didn't get any. Very interesting lake effects there. And the 2017 and 28 fire seasons are other examples of disasters of biblical proportions that were predicted by the prophets that are climate scientists. And we can think about STEM careers related to those issues as well, but I'm not going to talk about it for the sake of time and moving along. Having said all that, though, it's important to recognize that oil is not evil. Chances are very good that wherever you're sitting right now, if you look around you, that everything that you can see at the moment is there in some meaningful way because of fossil fuels. So fossil fuels made our modern way of life possible. They also endanger our modern way of life. And I think it's really quite important when we talk about these things to recognize both of those truths. And we tend to pay attention to one or the other and not both. And I think that neglecting one of these things loses a part of your audience. And if you can attend to both of these realities, then I think you're more likely to keep more of your class with you because they're both true. And I think both quite important. There are at least 5 ways, 5 reasons for exploring the use of this kind of rhetoric. The first is that we do it all the time. I think we do it a lot of time without thinking about it, and I think if we think about it, we'll do it better. The second is that such approaches of doom and gloom can have different outcomes for different people in the same audience. So some will be motivated to work to reduce potential impacts, some may simply tune out the messaging, and some may be motivated to work in ways opposing the storyteller's goals. And I think it's context dependent, depends on the nature of the community you're teaching in. But if you've got more than one person in front of you, you have more than one audience. There's also really good opportunities for interdisciplinary connections, particularly to ELA and the social sciences here. There's really, really important connections to mathematics and other ways for talking about climate change, but for this piece, maybe not so much. Attending to these issues is a vehicle for building understanding and appreciation of complexity. Understanding the use of mythological rhetoric can help identify problematic claims. If an argument is grounded in a Paradise Past narrative, meaning that once upon a time everything was rosy and wonderful, or if it promises a simple cure for multiple problems, or if the rationale is grounded in a narrative of good and evil, you should be suspicious of those claims. It doesn't necessarily mean they're wrong, but those are pretty good red flags for indicating that somebody's oversimplifying and maybe is thinking mythologically rather than scientifically. Well, some bottom lines. So you want to use apocalyptic framing very carefully or not at all, but moral framing is still quite important, and we're going to step through that right now. As noted previously, the world, we've been prophesizing the end of the world as long as we've been telling stories, but it hasn't yet come to pass, and I think that is kind of hopeful. And what I'm going to do next is step through some of my own family history as an example, not as something that you necessarily want to share directly with your own students, but think about how to tell your own story. And I'm really just going to read pretty directly from the slides here because I haven't gotten this memorized. If I was a real actor, I would memorize this stuff and rattle it off. So we live in wonderful, horrible times, and teaching about climate change can be horribly depressing work. It seems as though we are marching headlong into hellish times and are not sufficiently rising to the challenge. This, to some degree, is the natural state of things. We have always lived in horrible times, if you look at it that way, which I tend to do. We've also always lived in marvelous times. Sometimes I can see that too, but reminders are helpful. When the situation becomes dire, as it seems to be doing now, we do have a history of rising to meet the ominous challenges. It is my hope we're in the process of doing that now. To consider the concept of wonderful, horrible times, I'm going to quickly step through 5 generations of my own family history. My great-grandfather, Edgar Loomis, was born in 1843 in Lebanon, Connecticut, and my great-grandmother, his wife, Minnie Hardy, was born in 1847 in Ohio. Slavery was still firmly entrenched in the American South, and Adget and his brother Lucius both fought in the Union Army, and Lucius died at the Andersonville prison camp. Clearly, these were horrible times. And there is my great-grandfather in his Union Army uniform and his dear brother Lucius. The Civil War ended and my great-grandfather marched in front of President Lincoln. And I'd like to pause here and point out that I just talked to my Aunt Mildred the day before yesterday, who is 92 and knew my great-grandfather, and her twin is still alive as well. So I know people alive today who know someone who marched in front of Abraham Lincoln. So I'm 2 degrees of separation from Abraham Lincoln, and now you're 3 degrees of separation from Abraham Lincoln. It really wasn't that long ago. Horrible times were not over, but the abomination that was slavery did come to an end. Adget and Minnie married in 1871 and honeymooned in Niagara Falls. They went on to have 5 daughters and 4 sons and were married for more than 50 years. The brood included twins, Ruth and Ralph, born in 1891. Ralph was my grandfather. I don't know if his life was wonderful, but it did have some wonderful outcomes. And there are my great-grandparents on their honeymoon in Niagara Falls. If you cross your eyes, you can get a little 3D effect there. My grandfather also saw the tragedy of war, serving in a machine gunner's unit in World War I. He also saw pestilence, helping to manage an impromptu hospital during the Spanish flu epidemic. His twin, Ruth, died as a young woman, probably a suicide. But as these horrible things were going on, wonderful things were happening too. Nellie Brown, my grandmother, was the only woman in the University of Missouri's Rocky Mountain Field Camp, I think, in 1918. And Grandpa went on to earn a master's degree in agricultural economics and then a divinity degree. As an extension agent, he was effective in helping bring an end to swine cholera. He married Nellie, and they had 4 children, including twins of their own, Carolyn and Marilyn, my mother, who were born in 1931. And my grandparents were married for more than 50 years. Grandpa managed a dairy co-op and preached in several churches, and returned to agricultural extension work for the University of Missouri in 1936, and Grandma taught physical geography and more. And there's my mom and her twin. My mom always noted that she was never smiling, and her twin Carolyn was always the smiler. And there's Adolf Hitler. Hitler rose to power in Europe, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor, bringing the U.S. into World War II, and my grandfather was fired from the extension as, quote, the extension didn't need any pacifists, remembering that he came by it honestly as a machine gunner in World War I. A few years later, my father, Roger, enlisted in the Navy, though fortunately the war was in its final year. These were horrible times, but the war ended, and my dad served until just before the Korean War began. My folks met at the University of Missouri, Dad attending on the GI Bill. And there's the Cuyahoga River on fire. And Jim Crow was still festering in the South, and Joe McCarthy was feeding the Red Scare, and rock and roll was coming up, and life expectancy was growing, and the skies were black with smoke and smog, and rivers caught fire. And my parents married and had 6 kids, beginning with my brother in 1952 and ending with me in 1963, just a few months before Kennedy was killed. And Dad worked on technologies to see people through the forests of Southeast Asia, and my brothers worried about, but were not called for, the draft. And my mom was a university librarian who wrote books about books, and Martin Luther King Jr. and Bobby Kennedy were killed, and riots, and there was Woodstock and the Civil Rights Act and the Environmental Protection Agency. They were wonderful, horrible times, and Mom and Dad were married for more than 50 years. And there's us. I am the cute one. Hard to do this without hearing you. And Richard Nixon and Kent State and free love and disco, and the lakes and rivers got cleaner, and the bald eagle came back, and eventually I got married, and we had 2 wonderful kids, Kiana born in 2001, just a few months before September 11th, and Nellie in 2004, as the country grew more and more mired in America's longest war. And there's the village people. The world won't end. All along, we worried about the fate of our children in these turbulent times, whatever time it happened to be. All along, horrible things were happening that looked like the end of the world, And each time it looked like the end of the world, we did things to make it not be the end of the world. And okay, it never really looked like the end of the world, though it may have looked like the end of civilization. That doesn't need saving. This might. And my girls. Most people are beautiful. Yes, horrible things are happening now. This was largely written in July of 2016 in the aftermath of a series of horrible shootings that looks to be an unending series of horrible shootings. But violent crime is actually at its lowest level in decades, which is pretty wonderful. And in 2016 went down as the hottest year on record, which brought unprecedented droughts, floods, and fires to various parts of the world, which is pretty horrible. And my daughters are kind, hardworking, smart, happy, and engaged in things that make the world a better place, and they're beautiful. And hopefully your kids are too, and so are you. And there's the hottest year on record. I think 2018 may be on track to break that. There are horrible things in the world. When the horror becomes clear to enough people, we do something about it to make it less horrible. Let's do that now and celebrate the wonderful things too. We all want to be on the right side of history for the ones we love. So that's the fire and brimstone piece. There's more that we can dig into on rules of thumb for talking about controversial issues. But I'm going to stop there and take some questions, discussion, what have you.
Thanks, thanks, Don. That was a great trip and story that you've taken us all down. I mean, I personally appreciate including that perspective in the discussion of teaching climate. We've had a couple of questions that go back to the document from the Heartland Institute that you had both mentioned earlier in the at the beginning of the webinar. And a question that was asked that I thought was sort of interesting was by way of moral framing. Do you think that the publications of the Heartland Institute are intentioned from their perspective to correct the record? Do you feel that they are intentionally misleading? And if so, for what purpose?
Great question.
And yeah, I didn't want to go off myself, but I thought you would be a better person to represent that.
Well, I think that generally most people who reject the scientific consensus on climate change, which I sum up with 3 points. Climate change is real. And if you would rather use the term global warming, that's fine. Both things are going on, climate change and global warming. So that is real. It's a serious problem. It's caused by us, and we can do things to make it less bad. I think I said 3 points and then gave 4. So there are 4 points. It's real. It's caused by us. It's a serious problem, and we can do things to make it less bad. And I think most people who reject that are not lying, but they're wrong. And we respond to people who are wrong in a different way than we respond to people who are wrong unintentionally. Then we respond to people who are lying and who are intentionally wrong. And it's often really hard to tell the difference. And I tend to default to believing that people are basically honest. For one thing, the arguments for somebody who is lying, for somebody who's simply wrong, are often the very same as for if they're actually lying. If they're lying, it's a little harder to deal with. I do think there are, my gut says there are some people at the Heartland Institute who know they're being deceptive. And it's pretty clear from some documents that people working for energy companies knew knew many years ago that climate change was a real and serious threat caused by the burning, primarily by the burning of fossil fuels, and they worked to cover that up. And I think that's criminal, and I hope that the various court cases that are addressing that are successful. That's not quite what your question was, but it's all kind of background. I do think you'll generally be more successful treating people with kid gloves than calling them jerks, and actually looking at the rules for talking about controversial issues. Be nice is one of them, and somewhere in here it says, for the most part, people aren't lying. Where is that? Oh, right there. So 1B there. For the most part, people aren't lying. They largely believe what they say. That's not true of 100% of people, but I think you're more likely to be successful if you treat people as if they're honestly wrong instead of dishonestly wrong. One thing is very clear, and that's if you call someone a jerk because of their position on this, you're very, very unlikely to change their mind. They don't go, oh, you're right, I am a jerk. I should agree with you. That's not the way the human mind tends to work. So that relates to the point C there. Advocacy can deepen convictions more than understanding. So you want to be careful about how you approach that and not end up in a debate. You want to move from debate to discussion, which is the second point. There is, by the way, a link to a Prezi on this right there. But I don't think we have time to dig into that, but know that it's there and it's in the slides as well, in the PowerPoint slides, that is. So maybe that's enough said on that.
I just want to make, if it's okay, one quick comment about that question too. I remember in the Heartland Institute's book, there was one particular graph, a time series graph of global surface temperature, and it seemed to show that the Earth had not warmed over time, sort of over the 20th century. But if you look closely, you saw they left out data from recent years, or maybe recent decades. I'd have to look at it because I don't remember the exact years that they left out. It's hard, and those data are readily available, as are the older data. So it's hard to imagine why one would make that plot if you're not trying to be deceptive. But that's just one example.
Yep. I agree. I think that folks at the Heartland, many folks at the Heartland Institute, I think, are being intentionally deceptive.
And if I remember correctly, in your book, you do actually have quite a few resources that focus on aspects, if I may be so bold to say, about sort of the psychology of communicating about climate change.
Yep. Yeah.
And I really would recommend, if people have not yet, I mean, the link to the book should have been in the registration that everyone received, and it's a free download, and it's a terrific book with many resources there. So I really urge people to check it out and see for themselves how many, just great resources there are. So are there any other sort of major questions that folks have right now, or do you want to continue, Don, Ingrid, with?
I can.
Yes, please.
Okay, sure. Let me click on to the next Prezi here. And it's 8:45, so we won't get through all of this, but I'll introduce a little bit of it. I think there's stuff of interest here. If it loads. There we go. So it'll take a moment for the images to come in.
And just
so
a reminder, Don, that we do have a few closing slides that we want to be able to. Yeah.
Great. So this is drawing from a lot of our work at the Paleontological Research Institution across a number of different controversial issues. We've written a book on hydrofracking that does, by the way, include a chapter about teaching about hydrofracking. It's focused primarily on the Marcellus Shale, which that's a chunk of the Marcellus Shale in my hand there, and some of our other books, and we also have a book. Oops, in the wrong place there. We have a number of books on evolution and teaching evolution, and we have books on hydrofracking, and we have books on climate change. And you might look at the things that we do and say, well, what do those people want to get shot? Why are they picking the most controversial issues out there? And as it happens, all of these controversial issues deal with paleontology, which is kind of interesting to think about. And we also think they're very, very important. So we deal with important issues, and important issues are often controversial. And I'm going to fly past a bunch of this stuff for the sake of time. But really, a key motivator for me is trying to think about how to avoid repeating the problems that we see right now on a national stage. How can we get the next generation of adults, and hopefully change a number of the current generation of adults, to talk about controversial issues in a more productive way? I think pretty much everyone agrees that the national dialogue right now is a disaster. I'll also note that talking about climate change without talking about energy is like talking about lung cancer without talking about smoking. And that's, oh dear, I've forgotten who I'm stealing that from, but it might come to me. This presentation, which we will only scratch the surface of, does talk about all of that, but with a little bit more attention to fracking, and it's based on NSF funding, and there's one book and another book, and the links to the book. And I'll also note that we do our best to provide scientific information about unconventional drilling, hydrofracking, with as little bias as possible, but we also recognize that we can't fully recognize our own biases, and then no one else can either. So that complicates things. And I've already said stuff about that. One of my favorite questions to open up a session with is to ask people where the electricity in their state comes from. And I've got listed here the 8 largest sources for generating electricity in the U.S. It just so happens they're listed alphabetically, and it just so happens that the first 4 alphabetically are also the 4 largest for generating electricity. And I have people raise their hands and think about that, but I'll just ask you to sort of think about what are the 2 largest energy sources in your state for generating electricity, and then we'll go to what it looked like in 2012. I really need to get back and update this because the energy system is actually changing remarkably quickly. And this is now out of date. When we look at the U.S. as a whole, in 2012, we got more electricity from coal than from any other source. That is no longer true. The largest piece of the pie for electric generation in the U.S. now comes from natural gas, and coal has shrunk a lot in the last few years. And in New York State, coal, I think it's now 3 years that coal has fallen to the fifth slot on ranking. It's been overtaken by wind in about 2015 or so. It was overtaken by wind. So now this is the 2012 data again. Now the slice of New York's electricity pie that comes from coal is too small to see. It's less than 1%. And by 2020, New York State will get 0% of its electricity from coal. Most New Yorkers don't have a clue about that. I have done versions of this talk in many states, and it's interesting how different states have different levels of knowledge about where their energy comes from. If it's an energy state where there's lots of coal mines, for example, then people tend to know about that. And I just got a note from Bruce that there are a couple more questions, so I'll pause and take a couple more questions. So go ahead, Bruce.
Thanks, Don. You know, this, I think, is a very good question. Shannon asks, she says her school's having a day-long series of workshops on climate change that'll include panelists and workshops led by her science department. And she recognizes that climate change is a very complex issue. She's wondering if you can recommend any big bang for your buck activities or labs or resources that you would use if you only had one day to reach a lot of students.
Great question. I think actually looking at this question is quite interesting. And if I go back a slide or two and click here, it'll take me to the Energy Information Administration website, which is fascinating. And you can look at any state, and it'll bring up this interactive map where you can click on any part of the energy infrastructure in the country and get data about it, which I think is pretty interesting. You can also look at some quick facts about whatever state you happen to be in, look at information about consumption by source, and the pie charts were derived from this data set. So I think spending some time looking at this site is a good one. Another activity that I like to do is stepping through what happens to a gallon of gasoline when you burn it. And I have a presentation on that I can send a link to Bruce, and he can put it in the show notes, I guess. And it steps through not only how burning a gallon of gasoline, which weighs about 6 pounds and has some, sort of suggested ways of passing around a gallon jug of water that's 3/4 full, gives you a sense of what that 6 pounds feels like. And we burn more than a gallon of gasoline per person per day in the United States. And somehow that 6 pounds that you put in your tank is gone. But it's not really gone, because we know that energy is neither created nor destroyed. It's changed in form. And in case of burning gasoline, you take the gasoline as a mixture with the largest part of that mixture being octane. And it steps through the chemical reaction of octane combustion and turning that 6 pounds of gasoline into 19 pounds of carbon dioxide, because it combines with oxygen in the atmosphere. And then it steps through thinking about how much volume that takes up, and uses, passes around balloons and lets kids think about the empty balloon, then filling it up to be about a gallon size, and how many gallon-sized balloons you need to hold 19 pounds of carbon dioxide. And it works out to be about 1,100. From burning 1 gallon of gasoline, you get 1,100 gallons of carbon dioxide gas at standard temperature and pressure. And so I've used that at a number of climate summits, and it's, I think, a pretty powerful demonstration. So that's one thought. And like I said, I'll share the link with Bruce so that he can include that in in the show notes.
Actually, Don, if you have that, you can put that information into the chat box, and if you share it with the entire audience,
Okay.
everyone should be able to have that. And I think
Yep.
that what I'd like to do is that a number of folks have asked for some additional resources that I would like to share right now.
Okay.
And so right now, I just wanted to let everyone know that there are a number of additional resources to what Don and Ingrid have mentioned. Climate.gov is an excellent place to find both teaching resources as well as informational resources that you can share with students at a range of ages. The Climate Connection is great for getting a weekly digest of information on climate, specifically from NOAA. If you're looking for more data than you can possibly handle, opening up the fire hose, the National Centers for Environmental Data actually is one of the largest repositories in the United States and possibly even the world for climate, oceanic, atmospheric, and weather data. NOAA also has an excellent paleoclimatology website with slides and additional information. And there's a terrific podcast that NOAA's National Ocean Service did a few years ago, which focused on preparing for climate-related impacts. Some other non-NOAA but partner resources are the Climate Adaptation Mitigation e-learning website. The Union of Concerned Scientists Climate Hot Map is actually quite good for looking to see what impacts are in different areas and what potential solutions may be. And there's an organization that has Earth Labs that has a terrific series of high school level modules on climate that focus on very specific parts. And I will say that the Will Steger group, currently known as Climate Generation, has an excellent series of climate and energy curriculum, as well as professional development resources and how to engage the public on climate. So I really recommend all of those various resources to you.